Hello and welcome to the Indian Ocean World Centre Speaker Series. My name is Philip Gooding and I am a postdoctoral fellow at the IOWC based here in Montreal, Quebec, Canada. Like the 3 sessions from this semester that we have already held, today's event is being recorded, at least until the end of the presentation itself. Following the presentation, there will be a question and answer session, but we will stop the recording beforehand. The recording will then be uploaded to the IOWC's YouTube channel, so people can see it all over the world at a time that is convenient for them. Speaking of today's presentation, it is my pleasure to introduce our co-presenters, Professor GRIET VANKEERBERGHEN and Professor SENGUPTA. Professor VANKEERBERGHEN is an associate professor in McGill's Department of History and Classical Studies. Having earned her PhD in history at Princeton, she has written several publications on ancient Chinese history, including her monograph, The Huinengzi and Luan's Claim to Moral Authority, which was published with State University of New York Press in 2001, as well as 2 co-edited volumes, firstly Chang'an 26 BCE, An Augustan Age in China, which was published in 2015 with University of Washington Press, and secondly, Rulers and Ruled in Ancient Greece, Rome and China, which was published in 2021 with Cambridge University Press. Professor SENGUPTA is an associate professor of McGill University Department of Geography and the School of the Environment, and he is a co-director of the Roger Tomlinson Lab for GIS Science. He specializes in applying geographic information or GIS systems to spatial epidemiology, payments for environmental services, and water resources management. He is also co-editor of a 2017 volume entitled Agent-Based Models and Complexity Science in the Age of Geospatial Big Data, which is published with Springer. Professors VANKEERBERGHEN and SENGUPTA are the co-recipients of a SSHRC Insight Development Grant for a project entitled Representing the Mobility of Historical Agents Through Digitization, Topographic Pathfinding, and Dynamic Visualization, the Case of the Western Han Nobles. This project develops new digital methodologies for historical mapping using the migration of Han-era nobles in ancient China as a case study. The new tools that they are developing will enable historians to analyze and visualize the movements of peoples and goods. This will allow for further insights into, for example, the constitution of empires and other political entities, as well as an enhanced understanding of the experiences of migrants. The presentation that Professors VANKEERBERGHEN and SENGUPTA have kindly agreed to give us today is from this wider project. Additionally, in this presentation, Professors VANKEERBERGHEN and SENGUPTA will be ably assisted by Wes Wen, a PhD student who works on excavated manuscripts from the Eastern Han. Professors, thank you for agreeing to present today. You originally agreed to present work from your wider project during the winter 2020 semester, which we unfortunately had to cancel for obvious reasons. We are thus especially privileged and thrilled to have you as part of our relaunched online system for the 2022 winter semester. I'll pass it over to you now.
Okay, so thank you very much, Philip, for that nice introduction, and thank you to the Center for the long-standing invitation. We're very pleased that we're finally able to fulfill our promises to present our work. Okay, so oops. So let me, so we have a slideshow, and I'll start right in the middle of things. So with a few observations on kind of how and where kind of some of the basic ideas of our project. And one of the things that we that we started from is the idea that an empire. There is a lot of echo here. Is that my problem, or?
I'm currently muting all other participants in case it's related to that.
Yeah. So the idea is that an empire is not the kind of entity that we usually see represented on maps, such as on this map, which would be so it would seem as if the Han Empire is everything within the borders here, and then so the kind of with very, very strong borders. So instead of that vision, we would like to think of empire as an aggregate of movement. So we would like to put the concept of mobility central. So empire as individuals and or groups who travel to a landscape that can be both a natural landscape or can also be a human landscape. For example, soldiers, merchants, officials, nobles, migrants, colonists, etc. And the idea is that that we can see the constitution of empires or important changes in empires by observing how these patterns of mobility change. For example, where the travel takes place, whether it goes into new directions, who the main people are who travel, whether there are infrastructure projects, wall buildings, road buildings, the building of roads, etc. So this is what we would like to visualize with geographical methods. So our project concentrates on the Western Han Dynasty, which covers about the first 2 centuries BCE. But eventually, and we realize it's a long way off, but I think it's still important to that we keep this in mind. So the idea is to hopefully generate tools that might be useful for other periods of Chinese history, but potentially even for other areas in the world. So what we're doing is really apply geographical methods to historical data, and in doing so, we encounter 2 significant challenges. So in history, everything is always changing. So we don't. So we want to be able to register change over time, which is a very complicated thing. For example, in the case of the Western Han Empire, it's not only that the empire expanded, so acquired quite a bit of territory over the course of its 200 years, but also the internal administrative boundaries kept changing. So they were permanently in flux, and I can, it's very easy to show that. So this would have been the situation in 195 BCE. When we see large units in black here, these are all kingdoms. These are, commanderies that were directly administered by the court, and the court was situated here in Chang'an. A few years later, in 108 BCE, we see a completely different situation already. So there is expansion in this area, also here, Korea, what is now Vietnam. And we see that the black area, the kingdoms, have dramatically shrunk in size. And if we go one step further in 2 of the Common Era, that trend has even progressed further. So all of these things are important to, if you consider how a person or a group of persons move through this landscape, it's important to take this into account as well, because they might have to avoid certain administrative areas. There might be also internal. There are not only passes to leave, the walls or whatever, but there are also a lot of internal barriers, passes that we need to take into account. So we have to develop some kind of way to deal with change here. And the other major challenge that we have, and that maybe even more for a period of time that's so far back for the Western Han Dynasty, is that there is a lot of uncertainty in our data. And that can be because there are certain things we do know, and we have fairly good data on certain groups and on certain things, but there are always things that you would like your data to tell you, and that are just not there. For example, we kind of know where the commandery boundaries are, and commanderies are the relatively large administrative units, but also counties, which is the level beneath. We know they're there, we kind of know where their centers are, but exactly where their boundaries are is a very, very difficult problem. And so that's one thing we don't know. And then, of course, our documents, whether they be transmitted documents or increasingly excavated documents, have a lot of problems, right? We can have great data and then we miss, or then there are mistakes or missing information, etc. So it's you can't if you work on the present day with the GIS project, you can actually go out, and if you don't have all the data, you can go back. Unfortunately, with historical data, that is not possible. As Philip said, the project was written with a particular group in mind, namely the nobles. It's a very high status group in Western Han, but we very quickly decided or felt that that was too ambitious, and we kind of created. We have good data on the nobles, but because they are really all over the map in China, and China is a huge place, it seemed that it would be helpful to concentrate on a more modest project at first, in order to test our methods, and then hopefully kind of in a later stage we'll be able to look at the nobles. So rather than look at the group, we decided to concentrate our efforts on the travels of one individual. And that individual is a man by the name of Shi Rao, and Shi Rao died in 10 BCE. Shi Rao, and I'll say more about him, is a low-level local official. And we know so much about Shi Rao because his tomb was discovered in Jiangsu province in 1993. And the tomb contains, and I'll also say more about that in a moment, it contains a travel diary. And we thought that reconstructing kind of that his travels geographically would be an interesting way to jumpstart our project. So who was Shi Rao? So Shi Rao is the tomb occupant, the body buried in tomb number 6 at Yinwan. So it was a cluster of tombs, and this is in northern Jiangsu. As you can see, so this is Shi Rao's tomb. And the tomb has 2 coffins. So one is Shi Rao's own coffin, and then the one next to it is very, very likely, I mean, we don't have exact confirmation, but we really believe this is his wife's tomb. And then you see all kinds of objects buried here. From the tomb, it's already, I mean, given the material objects that are buried in the tomb, it's already clear that Shi Rao's position has something to do with writing. For example, here you can see a pen holder, which is this object here, and then 2 pens that are used for writing. But not only does he have lots of writing implements in his tomb, he also, there are lots of bamboo slips in the tomb, as well as wooden boards. And of course, it's from those texts that are buried in this tomb that we garner a lot of information about this man. So we learn a lot about his professional activities from those texts, but also kind of semi-private, more personal level activities. So what do we know about Shi Rao? So he was a low-level official. So as you know, the Western Han bureaucracy was very tightly organized, very hierarchically. So he would have worked at the lower levels of the bureaucracy. So the bureaucracy, the headquarters really were in the capital in Chang'an. And Chang'an would send higher level officials to the local units. And so these higher level officials were brought in, and they were never from the local areas. The low level officials, on the other hand, tended to be local. So they tended to people who lived very close by. And it created some interesting tensions between the outsiders who had the highest ranks, and then the lower level officials like Shi Rao, who had all the connections and who had all the knowledge of the area. And so we see in the documents we have of Shi Rao, we can notice some of that tension or that need for collaboration. So this is the area where he worked. So it's close if you think of, so this is the Shantung Peninsula. So it's in eastern China, and Tunghai, the commandery, it's a commandery directly administered by Chang'an, and it's a large commandery by the sea. And here we see an example of a wooden board that was drafted, presumably by Shi Rao himself. And so he worked in the main county, in the commandery headquarters, which were in Tan. So that's where he worked, and he had various positions. He made a series of promotions over the course of his career, but he seems always to have been employed by the governor, and the governor would have been someone sent by Chang'an. So here we see a wooden board that contains information about the population. So in Chinese or in the Han Dynasty, every year the population was registered. The register of the populations were drawn up at the county level. Then they were collected at the commandery level, and then sent up to Chang'an. So this, we think, is a document that presents a summary of the population that lived in the whole commandery. So after every county had brought its information to the commandery, it would be compiled, and then a special official would travel with these documents to the capital in Chang'an to deliver it to the chancellor, to the emperor, etc., with the necessary ceremony. So we see very precise numbers here, the number of households, the population. So we get an idea of the ratio, kind of the number of people per household on average. So we have quite a few of these official documents in Shi Rao's tomb. But then we also have a very interesting type of document, visiting tablets. So they're kind of really visiting cards or business cards that Shi Rao, for some, I guess, chose to take with him in his tomb, probably because he was proud of them and because he wanted to display them. So in this example, we have a governor, and this is actually not a governor, but the chancellor, which is the equivalent of a governor in a kingdom, and a kingdom is the equivalent of a commandery. So it's the chancellor of Chu, and as we will see later, Shi Rao repeatedly traveled to Chu. So the chancellor of the kingdom of Chu sends a lower level official to present this document to Shi Rao. And so that's, to inquire after his health and to make sure that everything was fine with Shi Rao. And the way it is phrased, it shows kind of an attempt by the governor to, the language shows familiarity. So it's not a very formal language. So he's writing as if he's writing to his friend. So so here we see that the kind of the social distance between this high official and this lower level official is being negotiated by examples such as this. So if we so this is just an overview of the text that we find in Sherrall's tombs. I've mentioned the first kind here. I've mentioned the visiting tablets. Other documents that we find in his tombs are donor lists. So we don't really understand why he raised funds at some point in time, but we get lists of people who contributed money to Sherrall for one or other cause. And so it's interesting because it really gives an indication of the extent of the social networks of Sherrall. We also get inventories of the goods that were placed in his tomb. A funeral in ancient China was a very public affair. People wanted to, they contributed objects for the burial, and they wanted that to be acknowledged. And very likely, these were lists that were actually read in public at the time of the burial. We also have a loan contract in which Sherrall lends money to someone who's also named Sher, so probably one of his relatives. And then interestingly, a lot of calendars and hemerological texts, so texts that provide methods to determine lucky and unlucky days to engage in certain activities. And then there is also a very, very interesting poem in the text about, we won't have time to talk about it, but it's a very, very interesting document. And then we have the diary of his travels. And so that's the document that we've been working on. And so this diary records his travels in the year 11 BCE, which corresponds to, and that's the way it's indicated in the diary itself. So the second year period of the Yuan Yan reign period of Emperor Chang. So it does refer to the imperial to the way that the imperial court kept time. So I'd like to say a little bit more about the travel diary. So the way archaeologists reconstructed the bamboo slips that belong to the diary, they reconstructed it into 76 bamboo slips, but some of them are only fragments. And because of the structure of the calendar or of the diary, it's likely that the original number was 62. And so the calendar, it's I think the best way to think about this diary is it's like a calendar, but it's a calendar that's formatted so you can write certain things on the calendar, and I think it's something we still do. And so a little bit like kind of a calendar you would put on your desk, and you're able to make certain entries in the calendar. These are the bamboo slips, and this is the first page. So these are the first 10 bamboo slips. And you can see, actually here is one that's completely missing, but you can see that the top part of this one has broken off, and it's only here that we start to have full slips. And it's kind of normal that in the beginning of a document we miss more material. And I've tried, I hope it's legible, I've tried to kind of, so the photo you see here, I've tried to kind of translate it into a table. And so the way it works, so here you see the months. So you have the first month, so you have the long months. That means the months that have 30 days. And then later in the manuscript, you have the short months. So you have 6 months here, and then later on you get a series with other months. Then the days are numbered, so day number 1, number 2, number 3, going to 30 in the case of the long months, going to 29 in the case of the short months. And then we also get for each day is also noted here with symbols. So the Chinese used I don't have this, I deleted the slide. They used the symbol of 60, a combination of 12 and 10, which yielded a series of 60. And so those 60 symbols are always there. But then we see, so here we have a Wu Chen Day, and then he makes an entry, spend the night at home. At dawn started my break and spend the night at home. So these are the entries. And so the kind of, I think what we can say is that the calendar was pre-formatted. So the days were there, and we have many, let's say here we have many days that are marked, but don't have an entry. So it's kind of fascinating. So he supplies information for certain days, but not for all the days. So what kind of topics does the diary talk about? Most often it's about where he spent the night. It can be at home, it can be at his dormitory. So these lower level officials, they tended to have a dormitory near the place where they worked. So they didn't commute every day the way we tend to do, but they tended to live close to their job. And then they had a hair washing day technically every 5 days, where they were allowed to go home to their families. But from what we see in Shirao's diary, that's not very, very regular. But then Shirao is a man who travels a lot, so we get a lot of information about the accommodations where he stays. And very often these were official accommodations, so a kind of hotels, especially designed for officials, and they could sleep there, they could have a meal, they could, if they had horses, their horses would be taken care of in this place, etc. But then sometimes he also stays in the houses of other people whom he names. We usually don't know who they are, but so it's not always official accommodations. And sometimes also in the dormitories of other people. So that's kind of almost the most constant element. He also mentions who he visits, for example, his own governor, or he mentions people who come to visit him at times. Interestingly, he also tells his readers, whoever they are, that he had to pay for a room. So he notes an amount and said, I had to pay that amount for my room. He's very interested in the weather, kind of rain, etc., etc. And then also his own promotions, when he has a leave, when he falls ill, etc. So here there are just just 2 examples. So for example, at sunset, arrived at the governor's compound and immediately presented myself. So here he pays a visit to his governor, and then so he has come from his home, he's arrived at the compound, or he's arrived from somewhere else, and then he says, I spent the night at the dormitory. This other entry from the Tingwei Day, which corresponds to May 29th, 11 BCE, there he spent the night at the relay hostel in Pengcheng. If you remember, Pengcheng is the capital of Chu, and it's the chancellor of Chu who sent him the visiting tablet that I showed you earlier. So here at dawn, he says, it was raining, so the weather, I fell ill. So he notes all of these things. The diary also includes major temporal markers. So it usually, if it's the first day of the month, it will say so. Equinoxes, solstices, etc., will be noted in the calendar as well. So if we try to to look at the geographical and temporal range of his travels. So it covers a year, I guess. So it's a calendar that goes by the year. So it's the second year of the Yuan reign period, and it corresponds to February 14th of 11 BCE to February 2nd of 10 BCE. So it's interesting how precise we know where he was on all of those days. And his travels during this particular year were confined to 4 administrative units. So there was Donghai Commandery, Chu Kingdom with Pengcheng as the capital, Langye Commandery, and then Cheongyang Kingdom. And what we've done here, so here you see the map by Tan Qi-xiang of the area that we're studying. These are the pink lines here are the administrative divisions. So this is Chu Kingdom, Cheongyang Kingdom. This is Donghai Commandery. This is Langye Commandery. And the places, the red dots are all the places where Shi Rao went in the course of that year. So I think I will hand it over to Raja now to to talk about kind of how we came to do things the way we did them.
So thank you, Reed. So now I'd like to talk a little bit about the geographic context of Shi Rao's travel. And before I do that, I'd like to thank Jing Rao, who just graduated with, or just completed her master's thesis. So just a big congratulations to her, and some of the work that I'm presenting was done as part of her thesis. So the thing about Shi Rao's diary is that it's great record keeping, and it tells us where he was on a particular day, but it doesn't tell us anything about his journey. It doesn't tell us how long his journey would have been. It doesn't tell us where he, what distances did he cover in that day, or what mode of transportation did he take a boat at any time, or did he depend on the horse, right, and all the time. So we don't have any information. One of the problems is that we don't even know the landscapes. We know something about the landscapes, but we don't have a clear picture of what the landscape that he might have traveled into that might have influenced some of his journey or his choices, or some of the things that he did on that day, right? And we'll talk about some examples in coming slides where we talk about him, where he talks about in his diary of chasing bandits, right? And well, if he's chasing bandits, and what's interesting is that the geographic region surrounding his chasing bandits is topographically one of the higher points of elevation. So you see, so he's chasing bandits into the ravines. So that sort of a thing. So we can sort of try to use modern geospatial data combined with Tan Qi-xiang's map to sort of derive some of these factors. And then we use some GIS analysis to sort of look at some of the answers, like how long would these journeys have been. So Reed, can we go to the next slide, please? So how do we proceed, right? So what we did is we focused on sort of three trips, right? So if you look at the questions are how long those journeys would have been and what modes he would have used. We used trips 1 and 2, which we call trips 1 and 2. One was to Pengcheng, and the other one was to Dongwu. And for the third question, which is how various landscapes relate to the activities, we look for his trip to Shanbei, right? So we focus on the first 2 trips to sort of look at where he, like what mode of transportation and how long and how far. And then for the last question, why did he go to Shanbei, right? So Reed, can we go to the next slide? And we basically therefore look for transportation routes. What's interesting is we don't know whether he went overland with roads that were directly connecting the cities. Unlike in the Roman period, when they have a good history of roads, there isn't such a detailed record of roads for the period, for the Donghai Commandery where Shi Rao was traveling. So we can't really say that he was really connecting the dots in the cities, but we can try to look for GIS techniques that might give us some answers. We do have from Tanchishan's map, of course, some information about the rivers. So we can say, were there certain river routes that he might have followed? And we can compare these two routes, right? So for overland route, we can use something known as a least cost path analysis, which basically looks at topography of the land. And one of the big assumptions we make here is that topography hasn't really changed for the last 2,000 years, right? And so here is an example of what the least cost path analysis does. Suppose you were hiking up from the orange dot to the orange arrow to the blue arrow, right? You wouldn't necessarily hike up and down mountains. What you would tend to do is take the direction in the direction of least slope. So you would try to find the gentlest climb possible from the orange arrow to the blue arrow, and you can do this with GIS and topographic map, and that's what we did. We took the USGS USGS digital elevation model and tried to imagine how roads might have taken the least steep path between to the origin and destination. And for the river route, which is, so this is our topographic route, this is what we assume that for the river route, we relied on a technique known as the agent-based modeling. And agent-based modeling is a sort of an emerging technique. It's been there. There was the Anasazi model that is very famous in archaeology about looking at how the Anasazi might have populated southwestern United States. We did a similar kind of model. It's sort of, you create rules of behavior. And in this case, as you can see, the red arrow keeps moving up and down. The idea behind this agent-based model is that it doesn't try to go down from point A to point B directly. If there is a river on the landscape and we know where the rivers were, we are assuming that Tanchishan's map was correct about the rivers. We can start from a location A and then try to get to the river. And then once you're at the river, then follow the river towards the destination. Of course, there may be some issues if the destination is not on the river. In that case, the agent does try to move away from the river. But in general, the overwhelming and the overarching importance the agent places is on following a river network, right? And so then we can start to look at some of the trips. And Reid, can you move to the next slide, please? And we can sort of try to see how the distances might have appeared if based on these two different geographic methods, right? So the first one, for example, is the overland journey to Pyeongchang. He's starting from his home. He goes to the dormitory, and then from the dormitory, he goes to Wuyuan, right? And from Wuyuan, he makes his way to Pyeongchang. Now, one of the things to note is that the trip from his home to dormitory to Wuyuan was a day, right? So he makes it to Wuyuan by March. He starts on March 4th, and by March 4th evening, he's at Wuyuan. And then there is unfortunately two missing entries. So we don't, this is where the gaps in data come in. But we know that on March 8th, he reached Pyeongchang. So he was staying in Pyeongchang. If you look at the landscape, and this is the least cost path analysis, you will see rivers cutting across the terrain. But the least cost path analysis is actually not following the rivers. It's actually going almost at 90 degrees. It's right at the direct path from his dormitory to Wuyuan to Pyeongchang is almost at right angles to the river network. So the question then is, was there a road that took him from Wuyuan to Pyeongchang following topographic mechanisms, or was there something? Was there a river route? So if we look at the next, so just if you don't mind, just keep in mind sorry, Reid, can we go back to the previous slide? There are certain kilometers, there are some distances, there's a distance measured by the least cost path analysis. So for example, from the dormitory to Wuyuan, it's 61.5 kilometers. If we take the same journey and we force a river network on it, which is the agent-based model, at the next slide, you see now from dormitory to Wuyuan, the same distance is 84.2 kilometers. Because what's happening is the agent is sort of forcing itself to go up to the river network and then follow it as much as possible. It gets even more, it gets longer when you think about going from Wuyuan to Pangcheng, because then the river network actually goes south to Shapi and then back up to Pangcheng. What's interesting is that in another travel diary, Shurao makes note of the fact that he visited Shapi before he went to Pangcheng, right? So, and the distances are much longer. It's 120.4 kilometers compared to the earlier distance, which was more direct over the topographic landscape. So it sort of lets us compare distances along the river as opposed to going straight over a topographic terrain. Next slide, please. We now repeat this for the trip to Dongbu, and this gives a little more nuance to the picture. As you can see, first of all, he's crossing several commandery and kingdom boundaries, right? And he is following the river, the river valleys, right? In this case, you can see there's terrain on either side. There's fairly high landscapes on both sides, and the least cost path analysis is finding a way that sort of goes in between the landscape, in between the mountain ranges to make the way. And of course, again, you get some distances. You get some fairly large distances. For example, 77.2 kilometers from Gaoguang to Dongwu over relatively hilly terrain. I would say it's in the foothills of the mountains. If you do the same route, if you look at Gao, just keep the 77.2 kilometers in mind for Gaoguang to Dongwu and move to the next slide, you can see that, Reed, can you move to the next slide? Yes, oh, sorry. And you will see that now it's 116 kilometers if you were to just follow rivers, right? So it gets to be a fairly long journey, especially if one is considering taking the river network, as opposed to having good roads connecting Gaoguang and Dongwu. I think now we will move on to the next portion, which is Rushwan. I believe it is Reed. Can we go to the next slide? And I think Rushwan will take over here for a little while.
Okay. Okay, it's my honor to be here to provide some information on this topic. People in the Han Dynasty could travel on foot, by cart, by horse, and by boat, not only in historical texts, but also in legal cases, administrative documents, and ritual texts. We find descriptions of how people traveled and how fast they did so. In some cases, there are records of the actual speed of travel, but others are speed requirements for etiquette or efficiency. The one we are featuring today, Shirao, traveled through a river-dense area, but it was also well-developed with a supposedly efficient route system. This is shown by many historical events that took place in the area during the Qing and Han dynasties. Emperors made tours here, generals marched with their troops. Hence, we may assume that all four modes of transportation were available in this region. Now, let us briefly discuss the travel speeds associated with the different modes of transportation. First of all, I need to explain that li is a common unit of length in China. And usually when the ancient Chinese texts mention 1 day, it means 12 hours, while 1 day and 1 night equals to 24 hours. On foot, walking speeds are usually recorded in relays of multiple people delivering mail, in marches, and in delivering supplies to troops. On average, speeds are between 30 to 100 li per day, but more commonly they range from about 20 to 33 kilometers per day. The cart that delivers supplies moves at a speed of 50 to 70 li per day, but a luxury carriage of elites could travel at an incredible speed. This will be further explained when I discuss horse speed next. As we know, horses are faster than other modes of transportation, reaching speeds of 400 to 500 li a day. In spite of horse speed not being specifically documented, there is one historical story about the king who, eager to get to the capital to obtain the throne, his carriage covered 135 li in 4 hours, and many horses of his entourage became incapacitated. On another trip on horseback, he ran 200 li in less than half a day, which was criticized by his minister. Horses relaying documents would have been the fastest. 1,400 kilometers were run in less than 7 days during one military order transmission. The last mode is boat. The boat speed varies depending on the load, the season, the water flow, and whether it is going upstream or downstream. But in general, it should be between 40 and 160 li per day. Okay, let's return to Shirao now. Prof. SENGUPTA will explain the possible travel options for him.
So we first lay out the distances on a table, and you can see that we consider everything against the Euclidean distance. That's the straight line distance between 2 points, A and B. You can see that the least cost path in several cases is actually much lower than the distances along the river. So the ABM simulation is the river route, and the least cost path is a topographic route over from connecting 2 points. And if you remember Rochman's presentation just a second ago, you will see that some of the distances that we saw could not have been done by foot, certainly, but may have been possible by boat. So I would say about 66 kilometers would have been possible by boat. But then if you look at the distance simulated by ABMs, none of them seem to be under 60 kilometers. And even if you consider home to dormitory visits, that's 34.7 kilometers, there's no river there, right? So not at least in Tan Qishan's map. So it seems more likely that there were topographic roads connecting these locations on the map. And to further prove our point, we can just go ahead with our backward 2 trips and compare the two, right? For example, in the first trip, yes, he could have taken the river, or he could have taken a more direct overland route. Unfortunately, if you remember, for this trip, we are missing the 6th and 7th of March, which causes some confusion for us. We're not able to directly say whether he would have traveled overland or by boat. It seems that the journey from home to dormitory to Wuyuan on the 4th would certainly have been overland. That much I think we can be fairly certain of. However, the trip from Wuyuan to Pengcheng remains a bit of a mystery, particularly because of the missing slip. As I had said earlier, he does talk about visits to Shapi in another occasion, and it may well be that the roads were also following rivers. So there could have been roads which would follow the river network along and go from Wuyuan to Shapi and then on to Pengcheng. For the next case, it's a little clearer. It seems clear that the distances that are covered are way more indirect if you take the river route, but more direct if you follow the river valleys and the topographic paths. So for example, if you go from home to Li County to Linyi to Gaoguang and then to Dongwu, and again there is a missing slip here between Linyi and Gaoguang, but more or less the rivers, the least cost path seems to follow the topographic terrain, especially in between valleys, and makes for a road journey. The other thing is this was done in the middle of winter, and we do not think that these rivers would have been possible at that period of time, right? They're mountain rivers, they're probably tributaries, small tributaries of the rivers, and they were probably frozen at this period. So it is most likely that this journey was overland and probably by horse. And then we move on to the next slide, where Reed will take us on a journey of catching outlaws. You need to unmute. Reed, you need to unmute.
Okay, so this is a bit of a different issues, but there was this one record in the diary where he leaves on a trip to Xiangpen, and this takes place from November 2 to 6th of 11 BCE. So, and then he says, at dawn, we chased criminals and then spent the night at the guest house in Xiangpen. and then he stays in Xiangpen for several nights longer, and we no longer have any mention of criminals. It's pretty interesting. So the question that arose is kind of, why is he going to Xiangpen, and why would there be criminals in Xiangpen? Now, from other texts in Shirao's tomb, it is clear that kind of catching outlaws or bandits, or however you want to call them, was an important activity of these officials. For example, I mentioned the hemerological documents in Shirao's tomb. One of these is a board with certain sections, with 9 different sections. Somehow, kind of the divination falls upon one of those sectors, and then you get answers. And one of the questions that they want answers to is about, will I or will I not manage to catch absconders, wangzhi. In this case, this will be people who are fleeing for the law. And then we see there are 9 possible outcomes, and I just list a few of them. So sometimes the board will tell you, oh, these people are going to be difficult to catch, or maybe not a good idea to leave on that day. Another day, oh, you will catch them, but then they will abscond again. Another day, you will not catch them. And then here, a load bearer, so someone who kind of carries a load on a pole on his shoulder, will have seen the absconders and can give you the information so that you can eventually catch them. So it kind of shows how this was definitely a topic of concern to officials of Shirao's standing at this point in time. Then also one of the more official documents that Shirao drew up is a document that records officials, higher level officials who have been transferred into Donghai Commandery because they were promoted. And here we see that catching criminals was sometimes a good reason for being promoted. So here we have kind of the person who became magistrate of Xiapi, and Xiapi is a county. Raja mentioned it, it's the county down river. So he is a person, and he earned his promotion to magistrate because he was able to catch a big group of bandits. So we can imagine perhaps that Shirao was eager to gain a promotion for himself. Maybe he himself wanted to be transferred, out of Donghai to a different commandery to earn a higher position. And hence, in that day in November, embarked on his trip catching bandits. And then Roswen, interestingly, pointed to a record in Hohanshu and that dates to about 38 CE, so some 40 years after our diary, where Xiangpen, the place that Shirao goes to, is mentioned as a place where lots of bandits have gathered. And of course, this is in the context of an official Jayung who goes there and then successfully roots out the bandits in the area. So the before he gets there, it says brigands openly moved about in Xiangpen in broad daylight. So they kind of, there was a lot of lawlessness apparently in this particular area. So that led us to ask kind of what did this place look like geographically. And so this is what it looks like. So Tan is the place where the seat of the governor is. It's also where Shirao's dormitory is. So to go to Xiangpen, he would have had to cross this one river. So Xiangpen leads towards the mountains here. And it's pretty interesting. So it's not that mountainous in itself, but it would be kind of a good path to get into the mountain. And we see one river going into these valleys, but these are fairly steep valleys. And we can assume that there are many, many different rivers, and so that these outlaws were actually hiding in those mountains, and that Sherall was trying to kind of make a mark, or his colleagues or whoever were trying to. So we're using this as a base to actually get to these outlaws. So this is just kind of one more example or one more possible application of the kind of the system that we developed. So to just formulate, we don't have very specific conclusions, but I mean, just some general conclusions from the perspective of a kind of, as a historian. I find kind of looking or thinking about the landscape as an agent in this historical drama, let's say, is very, very useful. And I mean, what is really brought to me is I really got to know the landscape in a way that I would never have thought about it before. So you get to know, like a place, Xiapi, suddenly it starts to mean something, because you start to understand where it is rather than it just being a kind of a place name. So I think that's a very useful feature. We cannot, these days it's very difficult to travel to China, but even if we were to travel there, the landscape has really changed dramatically, especially in this area. Most of the rivers that we find today have a completely different direction than the historical rivers. Also the coastline is much further out, so a lot of erosion has happened. So the landscape itself would not be recognizable, not alone, let alone all the kind of roads and buildings, etc. That really would not give you an idea of what things were like back in the day. So it's been a very useful project, and kind of you always make certain assumptions, and you find it in many articles. Or Sherall, he would have traveled along the rivers. And then if you actually go and look as we did, it becomes clear that very likely he did not travel along the rivers. And if he used the rivers, it was probably not kind of using boats, but using then a horse on roads alongside the river. So you get an insight in those fairly specific things, but they do help to kind of to deepen one's understanding of what was happening in that time.
And I see this as a new and emerging applications even for geospatial technologies. History is a very fascinating frontier, and the IOWC is certainly no stranger to geospatial analysis. I have been associated with IOWC in the past with mapping projects. But one of the interesting things I thought I should mention is the CBC just carried a news article about the Mayan temples, temple locations. There was a boy from Quebec who sort of figured out that the placement of the Mayan temples was following constellations. And now with mapping it on ArcGIS and looking at the spatial distribution, apparently the Mayans had road networks as well, and they were not, as previously thought, following river networks. So it's an interesting way of, I think, interrogating historical data, and in a fascinating way, because it's not like the modern world where we have too much of data anyway, right? The historical world, we don't have that much data. We have uncertainty in that data. And I think those are fascinating challenges to deal with, even with new geospatial technologies. Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you. These are lots of people and instances who sponsored us or helped us. So thanks to everyone who's listed there and who was involved in the project so far. That's it for us.
Thank you very much, all three of you.